The saying goes that behind every great man is a great woman, and in this case, that great woman was an 11-year-old Childbride. But without her, history wouldn't look as it does, and Shakespeare would have lost a play.
Once upon a time in history.
Hello, history nerds, and welcome back to Once Upon a Time in History. And as promised, I'm introducing my TikTok series, HERstories, to my podcast. I have already told this story on my TikTok as a two-parter, but I wanted to do it again. So, without further ado, this is the life of Mary de Bohun, or de Bohun, it's up to you. She was the mother of Henry V and the wife of Henry IV. And she's usually just a side note in their stories, but she was an individual. So let's give her story. It was in late 1369 or early 1370 that the English knight Humphrey de Bohun welcomed his second-born daughter, who was named Mary. Mary's mother was Joan Fitzalan, the Countess of Hereford, Essex, and Northampton, and she was quite a respectable lady. She was one of the principal landowners in Essex. Not much is known about the really early life of Mary, but in 1373 she would lose her father when she was just 3 or 4 years old, and the loss of her father made her and her elder sister Eleanor the two wealthiest heiresses in England. But it also put Mary and Eleanor under the wardship of the king, and the king at this time was the elderly Edward III. While it's lost to history what precisely happened to these two little girls over the next couple of years, their position in life likely gained them access to the royal court. They would have met many influential people, but one of the people that it's thought that Mary would have met during these next couple of years is a boy who at the time was known as Henry Bolingbroke. If this is true, it's thought that the two children probably got on like a house on fire. Perhaps due to their age difference of 2 or 3 years, Henry saw Mary as a little sister, but perhaps Mary saw Henry as a potential knight in shining armour, shall we say. But this is all speculation, and if Mary had felt this way, she would have been disappointed, because she herself, of course, had no control over her marriage prospects. Someone else had that privilege. The scheming in-law. Now, King Edward must have felt like he had struck gold when he had the wardship of these two little girls, because his guardianship gave him near complete control over their marriages. And it just so happened that King Edward's youngest son was still not married. Now, lucky for Mary, she was the second-born daughter, so it was her elder sister Eleanor that was eyed up. Unfortunately, at this point, it's 1376, and Eleanor is 10 or 11 years old, and this princely suitor was 21. This prince, the youngest son of Edward III, was Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, and history doesn't treat him too favourably. Thomas is viewed as a schemer, and in this marriage we find a perfect example of this. And what's this example? Well, when the couple married, they gained guardianship of little Mary. As the king before him, this gave him dictation over Mary's life. This included her tutelage and her marriage prospects, and alternative paths to marriage. Thomas had found an excellent opportunity. He had the wealthiest heiress in England as his wife, and her little sister as a ward. And as there was two of them, the inheritance was to be split between them, unless one of them could not inherit. Or better yet, if they relinquish their share. And why might a woman do this? Well, she would relinquish if she were to become a nun. It seems Thomas put a lot of pressure onto Mary to take the veil, even placing her in a nunnery for indoctrination. Luckily for Mary, Thomas had an older scheming brother as well. It seems a knight in shining armour was coming to her rescue. The Red Prince. Brothers, you know what they're like. One minute they love each other, the next minute they hate each other and would do anything to destroy one another. Or at least that is the case if you're royals. And for John of Gaunt and Thomas of Gloucester, this was certainly true. What you need to know about Gaunt is that number one, he is Thomas's older brother. Number two, he's the wealthiest man in England. And number three, he has a claim to the throne. Oh, and number four, he's a very ambitious man. And we'll throw in number five. Historian Ian Mortimer believes that Gaunt was, at heart, a rather romantic man. But let's focus on that ambition. At this point, John had one legitimate son, Henry Bolingbroke. Remember him? And Henry wasn't married. And Henry was 12, ready to start planning a marriage for, and out there was a very wealthy heiress at risk of losing her inheritance. Now, fiction writers and armchair historians really like to suspect that Henry and Mary were working behind the scenes on what happens next, just to give the kids, especially a little girl, a bit of autonomy. But we do know of one person who was definitely involved. Quite understandably, this was Mary's mother, Joan Fitzalan. It was at some point in 1380 that the pair began to scheme and put their plan into action. It was between July and November of 1380 that Mary and Eleanor were at Pleshy Castle without Thomas. He was away battling in France. And then John of Gaunt turned up. And he took her. And he took her back to her mother, where she belonged. But their plan wasn't complete, but it would be soon. Because Mary's inheritance was in mind, Joan did not want her to forfeit it, and John wanted his heirs to have it. Yes, Mary was to wed Henry Bolingbroke. It was on the 5th of February 1381 that Mary, just 11 or 12 years old, married 13-year-old Henry Bolingbroke at Arundel Castle in Sussex. Matrimony at arm's length. Due to Mary's age, we must immediately address a concern that I know most people will have. Was this a wedding and a bedding? The truth is, we don't know. But what we do know is that the couple did not live together for several years. I will mention now a common misconception, and that is that in 1382, Mary gave birth to her first child just aged 12 or 13. This is incorrect. Most likely, this was a child born to her older sister and Thomas. Upon the marriage, Mary returned to her mother, who had gifted her a Psalter, and this manuscript has survived, and you can find pictures of the beautiful illustrations, including one of Mary, online. If you're watching this on YouTube, I will of course include some pictures on the screen now. But if Mary had assumed that there'd be calm sailing from here, she was mistaken, because it was only in May of 1381 that Wat Tyler's rebellion began. This is also known as the Peasants' Revolt, and it's a very important part of history. Unfortunately, it can't be too important in Mary's story on the account that we don't know where she was, and we don't know anything about her reactions to the revolt. What we do know is that Mary's mother's lands were ransacked, but again, we don't know if they were on the property. So from there, all we can do is make assumptions. The peasants had a list of heads, and one of these was John of Gaunt, so by default, they also wanted Henry Bolingbroke, and unfortunately for Henry, he was hiding in the Tower of London. And he was there hiding when the peasants made their way inside. Knowing his location, we can assume that if Mary and Henry's relationship was a friendly one, She was probably quite worried for her husband, but other than this, we don't know anything about Mary and Wat Tyler's rebellion. For the next 4 years, there's nothing of Mary's life to note. There is nothing really to note of Mary's life over the next 4 years. We know she attended the wedding of Richard II and Anna Bohemia, and she was likely continuing her education and probably indulging in her hobbies, as Mary was a very keen musician. She played the harp and she liked to sing. A little later on in life, recorded in 1388, she purchased a tuning fork, and she was also known for arranging choirs. She may have been arranging choirs while she was living with her mother. In 1385, it finally came time for Mary to leave home, and not as a ward, but as a little wife. Life as a wife. In 1385, if that bedding ceremony didn't happen back in 1381, it happened now. Mary, now 15 to 16 years old, is living with her husband, and they do seem to have a loving relationship, or at least a very good friendship. As I mentioned, Mary was very much into music, and so was Henry. The couple used to like to play together. Henry would play his flute and Mary would sing. Mary and Henry were also keen commissioners of manuscripts. On all accounts, they seem to have been very educated young people, and they bonded over this. Henry used to perform charitable acts such as washing the feet of the poor, which is in reference to Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. It's thought that it's quite possible that Mary may have been involved in this. It would be less than a year that Mary would discover that she was pregnant. Mary had assumed that Henry would be around during her pregnancy, she would be quite wrong, because just a couple months later, the king would initiate a Scottish campaign, and Henry was going. In fact, Mary would be without her husband for the first couple of weeks of her child's life. We do know she wasn't entirely alone besides her household during her pregnancy. She was visited by Catherine Swynford, the lover of John of Gaunt and mother to several of his illegitimate children, later legitimised as the Beauforts. On the 16th of September 1386, at Monmouth Castle, Mary gave birth to her first child, a little boy, who she named Henry after her husband. September is usually the accepted date for baby Henry's birth, along with the story that follows, but it is quite possible that he was actually born earlier in April. Baby Hal would be quite sickly. He'd be quite sickly in childhood, but as an adult, he'd be a rather remarkable man, a force to be reckoned with. Mary would send an envoy to her husband to report the birth of their first child. Once he had visited his lands, Henry made it back to Monmouth Castle to meet the baby. Depending on whether her birth year was 1369 or 1370, Mary would have about 3 children by the age of 20. Just a year after the birth of baby Henry, Mary would welcome a second son, who she named Thomas. The following year, Mary may have suffered a miscarriage, but this isn't certain. The only thing known for certain is that someone within the household required medical attention. She would become pregnant just a couple months later and go on to welcome a third son named John. And the year following this, she had another boy who was named Humphrey. It wasn't until she was 22 to 23 years old that she would finally have a daughter, and this was Blanche of England. Blanche would go on to marry Ludwig III, Elector Palatine. Blanche had a lot of involvement in her children's upbringing. They seem to have been regularly in her presence, and she was very interested in their education. Mary also would have had quite a lot of control over the household on the account that her husband was rarely present as he was so often away on campaign. And when Henry wasn't on campaign, quite often he was located in London with the king. Despite being apart, Henry still showed some form of care for his wife, as there is multiple records of him sending food back to her, including fruit and fish. We know that Mary was reunited with her husband in the summer of 1393, because this is the time period in which she would become pregnant with her final child. And it is here that Mary's sweet, quiet little life slowly unravels. At Peterborough Castle in around April 1394, Mary went into confinement to await the birth of her child, and in June she welcomed her second daughter, who was to be christened Philippa. Mary likely didn't live to the day of her daughter's christening. She would be laid to rest on the 6th of July in Leicester. Mary was no more than 25 years old when she passed away, leaving behind 6 children and a husband who would refuse to marry for nearly a decade. But remember what I said at the beginning, that without her, history wouldn't look as it does and Shakespeare wouldn't have a play? Well, her husband would go on to usurp the king and become Henry IV, and after his passing, he would be succeeded by Mary's firstborn son, Henry, who you all know as Henry V. One son became the King of England. One daughter married the Elector of Palatine, and the other daughter, the daughter she barely got to know, would go on to be the Queen of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Thank you so much for listening to the 3rd episode of my podcast and my first HERstory on Spotify. More episodes will be coming soon, and you can expect more stories of the lives of women from history. But if you can't wait till then, go find me on TikTok. I'm Once Upon a Time in History, but also History on Crack. And if you're listening on YouTube, go find me on Spotify. And if you're listening on Spotify, go find me on YouTube. Oh, and I'm on Instagram. Thank you for listening, history nerds, and I hope you'll hear me again at another point in history.